Well, many people ask why God's existence isn't more obvious. After all, presumably God wants us to believe in him, and if he wanted, he could make his existence very obvious. So why does he not do that? And the first thing I would want to say in response to that is that just because something's not obvious, it doesn't mean there isn't good evidence for it. So in a scientific context, for example, it turns out that most physical objects, like this chair that I'm sitting on, consist mostly of empty space. Now, this is not obvious at all. In fact, it's almost obviously not true, you would think. Yet, nevertheless, scientists, as have studied what the world is like, will tell us that it consists mostly of empty space. So it's not obvious, but the evidence is very good. And so I would say that when it comes to God as well, the same thing applies, that although God's existence is not obvious, there is still plenty of good evidence for God's existence. But still, why does he not make it more obvious? And here I think it's important to distinguish between two senses of knowing God. One is knowing that God exists, just the factual claim that God exists. The other is knowing God personally. And so if God were just interested in getting us all to know that he exists, he could easily make his existence more obvious. But actually it might be that in such a world that although we would all come to know that God exists, we might have no interest in trusting in God, in knowing him personally. Indeed, I think when you look at the Bible, sometimes you see that this is exactly the case. People knew all right that God existed, but sometimes they didn't want anything to do with him. And so it may well be that in a world where there is evidence for God, but it's not obvious, we need to go in search of that, we need to look for it, that actually we come not just to believe in God, but to come to know God personally. And that's ultimately what God is interested in.